bonjour. I've got a slightly better accent than I did last time, which was bonjour, I think. But my introduction, I actually started out, I left the army after I went to the army as a youngster and left at the age of 21. And I was lost for many years. I really didn't know what I wanted to do. And I kind of fell into a job in a gym teaching like an induction course. And that gradually morphed. I went to work in London at a gym, became a personal trainer, had my own small personal training company, had my own small gym in London. And I kind of realized that I didn't really like managing people. So I then decided to dive more into the rehabilitation side and trying to become a better practitioner. And since I did a fitness and health degree around about 2003 to 2006. And at the same time, I was interning at a place called the Czech Institute in San Diego. And from there, that kind of really brought me into functional medicine, neuromuscular therapy, rehabilitation. And while at the same time I was getting into functional medicine, I was exposed to Ray Peat's work. It took me a long time to kind of get into understanding what he was talking about and looking at the bias that I had from functional medicine and over testing people, sending everyone away for a test, which was great for the bank balance because every time you referred someone for a test, you got a kickback from the lab. And that was quite nice. So getting my head around perhaps not needing to do that. And around about 2010, I started reading Ray's work. And I was still doing functional medicine stuff. And since 2016, I started my postgrad in endocrinology and doing a master's in endocrinology as well, which was really to challenge the bias about what I've been learning. And I do think that people can learn a significant amount from just reading some of the old textbooks out there, and particularly people like Ray Peat's work, Szent-Györgyi, and Selye, all of the others as well, who had a really big influence on kind of physiology, like cancer physiology, environmental physiology, and how it affects human physiology. And I don't think it's necessary for me to have gone away and do a master's degree, but it was nice to be able to go and do it. I was studying with doctors to understand how they're looking at it. And what made me realize is, one, that they don't look at nutrition at all. They when I was putting things up on regarding it in the forum and stuff, and it was like, well, yeah, we haven't really looked at this. It's not something we consider. So it was nice for me to go and challenge my bias and then see how other people and physicians are looking at hormones, because a lot of doctors don't think that your diet affects your hormones, but yet I could rattle off 15 different scenarios where food affects your physiology and your hormones now. So that's where I'm at now. And I've kind of looked at, I work with people around the world looking at different issues of energy, digestion, fatigue, fertility, sleep. I've done some short courses in neurobiology of sleep and neuroscience, which I've done over the last few years as well. So it's really kind of taking all that information now and how do I get it out there to people so I can just share that with other people. We talked about our friend Éric Lépine. I thought I knew what I was doing with synthesizing and applying Ray's work. And when I first moved here to the Middle East, not long after, I had all my mercury teeth drilled out and I was still trying to play football and my thyroid came crashing down. And actually it was coaching with Éric that kind of made me get a better idea of where I was at and what I needed to do. So Éric is a very clever guy and a very open guy, very sharing guy with information. And coaching with him made me realize that it doesn't matter how old you are. I think having a mentor with someone who has a bit more skin in the game is very, very useful for helping you to develop. And so taking his knowledge and synthesis and looking at all the stuff that I've read and doing my master's as well has kind of helped me to synthesize my idea of how I can provide more information, not just from a coaching perspective, but also help others to understand what I've learned over the last, I'd say 10 years is what I've been studying from a more of a biology hormone level. But it's kind of a synthesis of, the stuff I used to do as a trainer and as a rehab therapist as well, which I've moved away from quite a lot now because the complexities with biology and hormones takes up a lot of time. and I'm probably not as bright as some other people that can keep that going on, or trying to keep everything going all at once. My therapy work has perhaps kind of slowed down a bit now because I've been so focused on this work, which I'm happy with to a degree.
Amazing. When you talked about Éric Lépine, the way he introduced me to a new way of thinking was by sharing a video of Professor Sapolsky from Stanford University talking about chaos and reductionism. And the first time I saw this, basically I got lost like completely. I thought, I come from the background of what we call evidence-based, and you try to always find the newest and best evidence you can currently find, and you always try to go to randomized controlled trials, and then you go to meta-analysis and all that. And obviously for me it was pretty much the only way to go, because I had no other perspective. And when I started to understand how reductionism worked, only by just basically knowing at first that it does exist, the fact that you try to reduce an information sometimes a bit too far, and it's oversimplified, and you try to see things as almost mechanical, like you can just add pieces together, and you forget what you mentioned about Albert Szent-Györgyi and all these guys that see things with a flow of energy that is going through something, and that living is not something that you can directly compare to something that has no life, basically. And that completely changed my mind, and it wasn't frustrating. I directly told him, well, Eric, I'm really, what did I say? Je suis vraiment perturbé en français, and and then I said, but in a good way. So thank you. And then we talked a little bit more, and I started to look more at Ray's work as well. But it's fairly recent for me, so I'm amazed by the amount of information you can bring towards all of this. I would say even maybe a universe of a different perspective that tries to put things together, right, rather than just putting things in different pieces and say with different experts of single molecules and things like this, I'm the expert of this, and trying to get a coherent picture, and still not lose the sight of you say practicity, the putting things in a practical manner. And so that's how I got introduced to Ray's work, if I may say. It was pretty amazing.
Yeah, and I think Ray's work is so often misinterpreted. I think if you ever come across anyone who says, oh, he's the sugar guy, he's the ice cream guy, they really have no idea of what he's talking about. And you can spend your whole lifetime just reading the works that Ray Peat's put together with all the references, because he's the person that introduced me to Katharina Dalton's work, who was the doctor that came up with progesterone therapy, Szent-Györgyi's work, Gilbert Ling's work, Selye. Well, I knew of Selye because everybody knew about the general adaptation syndrome, right? But all of the other things that are associated, and if you look at, say, Broder Barnes's work from the 40s and looking at thyroid physiology, or whether it's, the Biskin's work on liver function and B vitamins, there's so much information that you can take out of that. And for anybody that ever says, oh, he's the ice cream or the sugar guy, clearly has not looked at any of his work on even the most minuscule level, because it's quite frustrating when you hear people talk about that. But his work is a vast body of work that dates back to the late 60s. And unfortunately, because you tend to think when you start looking at work that has this complexity, you think of it, well, why isn't a lot of this mainstream? And there are, if you look at certain physicians and doctors, they do understand the role of progesterone as an anti-estrogen, as an endometrial kind of health hormone. There are doctors that understand that actually you can't measure thyroid physiology accurately when someone's in a state of stress. Perhaps my interest at the moment is how the impact of pollution totally dysregulates thyroid physiology. And even if someone's under emotional stress or not eating effectively, some physicians do actually understand that this is a really chaotic way just to say that your thyroid, the blood tests appear completely normal, therefore you don't have a thyroid issue. And it's generally this binary thinking that is perhaps leading the way in some of the issues we're seeing in viral expression and the susceptibility and the high mortality rates. when somebody's being prescribed a high cholesterol medication or an antihypertensive or metformin for glucose issues, for example, you know, if somebody lives in a high pollution area, this can be a key reason why these single actions like a high cholesterol level is being perceived, but then the thyroid blood test is being perceived as totally normal. And this is a prime example of reductionism in medical, well, it's industry. And you know, I'll try not to get pulled too far into the fact that maybe people do understand this, but it's far more commercially viable to keep a $30 billion industry of cholesterol medications going on, rather than saying, hey, actually, let's look at thyroid physiology. But there are nuances and problems associated with that, which we can talk about later if you wish. But yeah, these are some of the many problems that are associated with looking at holism within medicine. And it is complicated. It's taken me quite a few years to get to the point where some things I can talk about quite fluently, but I'll put my hand up in the air and say, look, I don't know about this. This is something I need to either look at, go and research. And even, you know, some of the complexities with thyroid hormone, I don't even know everything about it. Some of the stuff that I learned back in my postgrad, I've totally forgotten about. And you need to keep pulling back and refreshing yourself. So when people look at some work and say, well, that's complex, I don't get it, it's literally just kind of keep going back and reapplying yourself. Like Ray's books and news articles, I find myself going back through his old newsletters and finding real gems of stuff that I missed the first time, or I literally didn't understand the first time around. So that exposure, it's a bit like weight training, right? And, you know, specific adaptation to impose demand, the brain starts to get it as much as the muscles get it from lifting a decent weight.
That's a good parallel, because I would say pretty much everyone that is listening to me is usually involved in the, I would say, fitness industry. We don't use a lot this word fitness industry in French, but I think it's a good. But it's important to talk about this also, because when you talk about, for example, supplements or all of these quick fixes that you try to sell, it's all part of this whole quick fixes, a single thing that can help you. What's the best thing that you can do for this? What's the best nutrient for this? What's the worst thing that you can do? And you have almost all the time this perspective about trying to get one solution to one problem, and you cannot, it's almost like it's impossible to go in and have a broader perspective, because it's not the way people try to think. We all try to simplify, and even when we talk about science things, we try to also simplify things so people can understand. And you got it. And and well, yeah, that's one of the amazing things I found in your work. And maybe if you can talk a little bit about this, having a bigger picture, but still having practical things that you can say to people. For example, how can you know that your environment in general, and that's very broad, is right now affecting you? Do you have a few things that you would consider, like if you don't have access to blood work, or if you don't have access to complex things, simple things you can do with let's say maximum $20, €20, and you can manage your own health in a certain way. Do you have a few ideas that you could share?
Yeah, well, I kind of, I'll lead you to a well-known saying that a lot of people say, is like, you can't get well in the same environment that made you sick.
Oh, that's good.
I will actually say that you can. And
okay.
Because if we didn't do that for a lot of us, that means a lot of us will be dying, because the environment can be stressful for a lot of people. So sometimes when there's perhaps some emotional stress, physical abuse going on, that's an environment that definitely needs to be changed for the better. But for many people in urban environments, it's very difficult to get away from the stress of modern living. So we know that pollution has a specific effect on many different things. And the Endocrine Society has even shown that cancer, heart disease, metabolic syndrome, diabetes are a product of ubiquitous environmental pollutants that are around these days. And going back to why that's problematic for thyroid physiology, for example, is that the carrier proteins for thyroid hormones are often, they can be hijacked by various pollutants. So airborne pollutants, soot in particular, can have an effect. Plastics can have an effect. And even the unsaturated fatty acids combine to this thyroid carrier protein that make it appear very, very normal. So there's one aspect of stress that perhaps we can't get away from, but it might be beneficial for somebody to realize that living in an area that's really polluted, they might want to spend more time going off to the country. But to get back to your question about things that we can do to help to analyze that, is that we often have when somebody goes to the doctors, they're usually going because they feel that something's up. So they'll have a clinical presentation and they'll have a biochemistry presentation. And the problem is that a lot of doctors is that they will be looking for that biochemistry presentation because they've been taught that that's the gold standard. So when it comes to thyroid physiology, for example, we have TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, that is supposedly the gold standard. Now, I can show many different studies where it's been shown that TSH can be completely normal. One of the most common reasons for TSH being completely normal is stress. Now, how we define that stress is, could be physical stress, it could be chemical stress, it could be emotional stress, and all have the same effect. So let's take, for example, the industry that we've both worked in, which is the kind of health, fitness, well-being, whatever we choose to call it, is that you know, a very common thing, and particularly the people that go into the kind of physique competitions, is to go into an effective regime of starvation to get to a very low body fat. And it's well known that the female competitors often get into a state of amenorrhea, they lose their menstrual cycle, and this is an energy related issue. Now we bring that back to specifically thyroid physiology. If you're not getting enough calories in, you have to stimulate energy production from the regulation, from the upregulation of the stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, glucagon. We need these to liberate energy from stored fats, and if it's a really bad way, stored proteins. So this is why the concept of just having enough energy in, if you're not in that state, it will make your thyroid hormones look completely normal. And this can knock on to T3 and T4 as well. So we have our TSH, which is our pituitary hormone when we're not producing enough, and T4, which is the precursor hormone, to T3, which is generally known as the more active hormone. So even these can appear completely normal. So the doctor will go, these blood tests look completely normal. And my master's degree was looking at, well, you can have these blood tests that are completely normal, but this clinical presentation, which could be hair falling out, fatigue, weight gain, but not necessarily weight gain, could be failure to gain weight as well, which is another paradox of thyroid dysfunction not a lot of people think about. You think about your classic calorie restriction clients in anorexia, which is a very advanced stage of calorific restriction. The thyroid's not working in this because we've still got a lot of stress hormones being produced. So this clinical presentation appears completely at odds with the blood tests. So we might have also constipation, we might have infertility, we might have loss of menstrual cycle, we might have low testosterone values, we might have sleep physiology all over the place. We might see the symptoms of high blood pressure, high cholesterol, dysregulated glucose metabolism, all very common things that we know tend to happen in a disease state. But the doctor will go, well, the thyroid appears completely normal, but the clinical presentation, they're not usually looking at as efficiently. And the other factor is that doctors are very, very rushed. They don't have the time to go into how much emotional stress are you under right now? How much nutritional stress are you under? Are you eating enough? Are you getting enough sleep? All of these factors that could have an impact. And if a typically stressed female housewife or anybody who's stressed, doesn't have to be a female, is under eating and maybe skipping breakfast as well, the likelihood of this TSH value and often the T4 and T3 values to appear normal can be, why somebody's not being diagnosed as having low thyroid, or even that there's another contentious value, which is subclinical hypothyroidism as well. And so an easy way to look at that, in fact, I've even got one of his old books here, is Broder Barnes' stuff from the 40s. He was suggesting that actually people didn't get heart disease if you managed to look at thyroid hormone efficiently or thyroid function. He used things such as the basal metabolic rate test. But equally, what he decided from this is that if you looked at someone's body temperature, then you could get a really good idea of their metabolic rate or how well they produce energy. So taking your temperature can be one of the easiest ways. There can be nuances behind this. Now, in my study that I did as part of my master's, I also decided to look at the comparison between the oral temperature and the armpit temperature.
Yep.
And there are different theories of what body temperature should be. And most mammals or endotherms should regulate their temperature at around about 37 degrees. What's super interesting is that if your body approaches 35 degrees, you start increasing the stress response because you go to hypothermic values. That means the body starts to lose control of the enzymes that don't work efficiently. And bear in mind that estrogen also has a similar effect on this as well. And so your body will present, it doesn't want to get to 35 degrees. So it can start increasing body temperature by regulating the stress pathway, which often involves sometimes using brown adipose tissue as well. And so we can see that temperature can also appear completely normal, but I'll try and talk through the nuances of how we can get through that. So your oral temperature should generally be around about 36.5 degrees on waking, and after a good feed should go to 37 degrees. I kind of like to use the armpit as a test between the mouth and the armpit, because I think it gives a really good indication of why somebody can appear completely normal in the mouth, and why if somebody with a cooler armpit temperature can be suggestive that there's a lower thyroid state might be present. So for example, with the head, thick skull, very hard to dissipate heat. Although you're taking the temperature in the mouth, it's still a very warm area. If you see a low body temperature in the head, bear in mind that the brain uses a vast amount of the body's available glucose stores, and it's very hard to dissipate heat. This is the last place you should be seeing your body temperature decreased. And when your body temperature is decreased at the head, you can pretty much assume that there is a low energy state. And I think Peat has even called this cold brain syndrome based upon other studies. So what I looked at in my master's study was saying that actually there might be a correlation between the armpit and the mouth. And so this armpit should be within half a degree or so of the head reading. Now, some studies use something called the compartment theory and said that it might differ 2 or 3 degrees below. And bearing in mind, the armpit is not the most accurate place to do the temperature. By the way, if you want to kick in and I'm talking too much, just let me know.
No, I think right now it's fine. But if I may just take about 30 seconds to summarize, we're talking about the idea of knowing pretty much where you're at physiologically using the temperature, but you have different types of reading and different types of interpretation. For example, before and after a meal, maybe if you can clarify before going a bit further, why should the temperature increase after a meal? What does it mean? Does it mean that the meal has an effect? Does it mean that every time you eat, there's a direct response? Is it specific to carbohydrates, to fats, or to something maybe more basic before going a bit further? And I'm sure we can go a bit further, but just so we can get everyone to follow.
Yeah, absolutely. So typically when somebody wakes up, their body temperature in a good optimal biological state should be around about 36.5 degrees. Now, after a good feed, your body temperature should go up to where the normal is of about 37 degrees. And that's where most mammals regulate their temperature quite well. Now, if your body temperature doesn't go up, I generally find there are 3 main reasons why that doesn't tend to happen. One is the food that you're eating is not giving you an optimal thermodynamic response. It doesn't heat you up because you might not be eating A, enough calories, B, you might be eating anti-metabolic foods. So that's going to have a specific effect on not making your body temperature go up. And that's obviously quite easy to change. Second, we might have digestive inflammation. If your digestive system is not where it should be, if it's damaged from a variety of reasons, anywhere from stress to some foods can have a specific effect on someone, environmental pollutants. If you can't digest and assimilate nutrients properly, then this will have an effect on, 1, uptaking thyroid from foods, and 2, being able to regulate enough energy to get that thermodynamic response. And you might see issues like irritable bowel with this as well, was where people just can't get the nutrients from the food. The other reason is, despite eating the best type of food in the world, is that the ability to regulate your hormones, and particularly your thyroid gland, to have this warming effect on the body is significantly lost. So these are generally the three main reasons why the temperature doesn't increase for some people. Does that answer that so far?
I think that's perfect, but we needed this for, I would say, most people to be able to to keep going. That's perfect. Thank you. So,
Yeah,
can you find where you when you were at?
So the reason why I think the armpit temperature and the mouth temperature can be something to correlate with is, one, to find a happy medium between the two. But if say your armpit temperature is often, I've seen it a couple of degrees lower before, and I've seen these very subtle symptoms of low thyroid issues that are creeping in. So if you say, for example, your head is relatively normal, close to 37 degrees, but it's not quite up there, and you've got an armpit temperature that's a degree or two below, sometimes you might see these kind of cardiac manifestations. This is just a theory of mine. You might see the slower heart rate. You might see constipation, or, remember, one of the key symptoms of low thyroid function is reduced bowel motility. And therefore people often get constipated, or the movement is really, really slow. So you may see the trunk slightly cooler from the head, because the brain is the area where you're going to keep it functioning as well as you can do. The brain doesn't want to get cold. It doesn't want to utilize fats as a fuel. It prefers carbohydrate due to the metabolic byproducts. So I think making a distinction between the armpit and the mouth can be really, really useful in identifying these subclinical low thyroid states. So I like to use that to start with. And if someone's armpit is within half a degree of the mouth, I'm not too fussed.
Okay.
But if it's slightly more than that, I want to kind of investigate what are the other things going on. So going back to Broder Barnes's kind of theories, he used to use something like the Achilles tendon reflex, where you tap on called Waltman's sign. You tap on the tendon, and what should happen, it should be a quick reflex like this, the myotactic reflex. But in hypothyroidism, when you tap on it, it's kind of there, and then it goes back really, really slowly, like a pneumatic closing of a door. And this just tells us that the ability for neurotransmission from the brain, ability to produce adequate energy, contraction, relaxation is lost. And I generally sometimes see that this lower armpit temperature can be associated with this kind of reflex. Now, sometimes when people are stressed out, or they're not eating enough food, for example, this temperature orally and in the armpit can be increased because we're running off the stress hormones. So you'll see people with these really negative symptoms that you look at them and their body temperature is close to 37. Their pulse appears relatively normal. Now, bearing in mind for what I think, and based upon Peat's and Barnes's work, is I think a normal heart rate is somewhere around about 70 to 85 beats per minute. When you start going above 90, we might be suggesting that there's definitely an adrenaline type response, producing too much cortisol, and these might be some of the factors. And generally, even some of the hypothyroid studies have found hypothyroid people diagnosed by biochemistry with heart rates between 60 to 80 beats a minute. Now, a lot of these studies, you're not looking at what they're eating, how much stress they're under, so you don't know how this effect is compensated for by adrenaline, by cortisol, noradrenaline, all these stress responses. So you might see people with this normal temperature and normal pulse rate, but then when you start giving them some productive pro-metabolic type foods, their temperature decreases and their pulse rate decreases, primarily because you're just not running off the stress hormones anymore. And the body, instead of running around going, like this, and just not being able to function, the body goes, right, you're giving me what I need. I've got extra sodium, I've got extra glucose available, I've got adequate protein available, and the right type of fats. The stress response significantly diminishes, but then you're left with this low temperature, bradycardia, and sometimes I've seen clients with values as low as low 40s. And this can be that they're so used to running off stress for this long period of time, it's significantly reduced. And now the body's saying, this is where I'm really at. So some people can actually feel significantly worse after this, because they're able, the low thyroid state is able to properly manifest itself rather than being in a compensatory mechanism. Equally, some people they might just start feeling better. And that is usually the sign that you're going to get a really good result with just food and modulation of light, getting adequate carbon dioxide in. But then some people are going to need a little bit more stimulus to get them working again.
There are a few things that I would like to clarify, and maybe you can jump on this afterwards. The first thing is that usually, especially in exercise physiology, we tend to see, you know, the heart of an athlete, and we tend to say that the lower you are, the fitter you are, and people usually don't dissociate the fact that you know, you can get better in the performance realm without necessarily being the healthiest person on earth, because there are some things that happen that maybe that may go directly against your health. For example, let's say you have a slower metabolic rate compared to your opponent, and the goal is to be as quick as possible for a 20K or 30K kilometers run. If you are hypometabolic, even a little bit compared to your opponent, you may win just because you are you have more margin to use your energy directly for your muscles, and these adaptations may in fact be not that healthy, even if we see them as the healthiest people on earth. And maybe you can talk a little bit about this, and maybe what type of problems they may have. For example, we talk about the athlete's triad, especially for women, when they don't eat enough and they over exercise and things like this. And maybe, you know, just to give a few explanations on people and why the athlete's heart may not be the healthiest heart as we see it with a low heart rate. Maybe if you can talk a little bit on this.
I've always used the concept with clients is that fitness doesn't correlate to health at all in any shape or form, but there's a certain level of fitness that is complementary to physiological life. We know that we need to move, we need to have a certain amount of strength, and to a degree, a certain amount of cardiovascular fitness, which is intertwined with all of that. But when we talk about the adaptive responses of heart rate, you know, and there's also a lot of contention with this in lots of aging studies where they correlate lower risk of mortality with lower heart rates, but nobody's looking at the nuances behind that, because if your body's in a stress state of physiology, your heart rate's going to be much higher. The compensatory adaptive mechanisms will make the heart rate beat faster. When you're running off adrenaline and cortisol, as your physiology ages, it becomes less efficient, and therefore we fall back on the stress hormones. So no one's ever looked at kind of untangling that from what is optimal physiology in aging. Now, when we bring that to fitness, and I said, you know, fitness isn't health, and the higher you go up from an elite lab into elite fitness, your fitness goes up, but there's a trade-off between health. And you talked about the female triad there. There's a key reason why a lot of women stop menstruating, is because the physiological load and the calorific intake is not enough to support physiology. There's not really any difference between a high-level athlete, say a marathon runner, and a stressed housewife who's not eating enough, because what you have here is really a lack of energy supporting optimal available function. I had a client not too long ago. She hadn't had a menstrual cycle for 5 years.
Wow.
And she was literally not eating enough and suppressing the amount of progesterone that she needed to have an optimal menstrual cycle. Now, you just extrapolate that, and you have more workload and a very fine window of how much energy somebody's taking on board to keep them at a certain body weight for optimal physiological function. That fitness is going to be contradictory to optimal health. And the female losing the cycle is usually a sign that physiological organizational hormones like progesterone are lost. Now, when you're in a stress state of physiology, that you'll kind of lose the ability to produce and bind progesterone. And when bringing it back to heart rate, for example, is hypothyroidism. There's a very well-known symptom of bradycardia, or low heart rate. Now, the adaptive response in fitness is slightly different, but we tend to see that runners do have a much lower heart rate and they have a higher VO2 max. There are plenty of studies that show that runners are just as predisposed to heart disease as the normal public in some cases. You see high cholesterol levels, you'll see athero and arteriosclerosis. And this is because there is an adaptive mechanism of the heart to get increased contractility, your left ventricular hypertrophy, your kind of athletic adaptation to the physical demand. But you can still get aspects of fibrosis of the right side of the heart, too much serotonin being produced. And remember, serotonin is produced in the stress pathway to upregulate the adrenocortical response. So, aspects of the hypothalamus and the pituitary and the adrenal glands in the self are upregulated by serotonin. So that you can still get this kind of fibrotic heart and still have a fit heart. But what I'm not saying here is that you shouldn't exercise. I'm saying exercise is great, but if you're trying to maintain a high level of function, that will have a negative effect to health at some level at some time, depending on the individual environment and context that they live in. So I think it's really important to understand that, yeah, we need to do certain type of exercise, but there is a trade-off, and whether it's your bikini or physique competitor who's restricting down, there we'll see context to what type of physiological function that they lose. Whether you're a stressed person running around, I've been looking after kids all week, homeschooling because of this lockdown, and I've certainly got into a certain amount of stress, but I've kept myself eating through it and stayed relatively sane. So yeah, it is understanding that there are certain adaptive responses, but it's also, I guess, where you look at it, we have this perception, or there's this perception by the public of the fitness industry, that when they see someone that's ripped and shredded, and this is the aspect of what is healthy. Now, it's only a relatively modern phenomenon where we apply this rationale to thinking. Certainly we can see someone's more athletic, but the concept that they're actually healthier is something that's lost on a lot of people. And you see, I've seen countless fit pros or people who've gone through physique competitions, and the net effects have been dysregulated sleep, blood sugar levels, fatigue, menstrual cycle, T levels, all of these that have an effect because the exercise has become the stressor and not something that's compatible with normal function.
That's a very, very important point, because when you try to bring all these pieces together in order to keep a healthy body, you have to consider that it's not just move more and eat less and everyone is eating too much, because if you have only this in mind, basically the calories in versus calories out in your mind, you don't see how every single nutrient is interacting with the body, and you just think at a certain point you eat too much, so you can either exercise more to solve the problem, or eat less, or even worse in a way, depending on the situation. Obviously, you can do both at the same time, and in this way, you have, as a general rule of thumb, you tell people overeating is the problem, and this is the hardest part, maybe for most, I would say, health professional to try to understand what Ray Peat is suggesting, and what people like you are talking about, is that you need a certain coherence between the energy input and what you are doing, and it's not only the physical demand, because the brain itself is already more than 10 watts and it's using a lot of energy, probably more than 100 grams of sugar per day. Plus you have all the rest of the lean body mass, plus you have all the different things you can consider, maybe even uncoupling effect, the amount of energy you can generate directly as heat, and all of these things that are important for the maintenance of a healthy body. And we tend to say that it's only once you've lost weight that you are going to be healthy, that you are eating too much. There's almost this authoritarian way of saying it's your fault, you've been eating too much, you've been you haven't been exercising enough, and we are telling people you've had a sedentary lifestyle, and that's the worst thing. And I'm not saying it's the best thing you should do, because of course we see it a lot and everything. You should move, but you should also have the ability to spontaneously move. Like you shouldn't feel stressed completely and exhausted and still say, well, you need to move and this is the way to go healthy. You should have the energy to move as well. So maybe can you try to put a bridge between these two apparently opposite way of seeing the health and caloric surplus and all that? Can you maybe solve the problem?
maybe you're talking about excess calorie intake as compared to okay, sure. So I think that there are some things, nuances. I think a lot of people, and it comes down from an authoritarian approach, especially authorities, when it says, obesity and overeating is an individual choice, but yet the environment has become extremely stressful for people to live in. Now, if you live in a city, we know that there's certain pollutants that become stressful, but we start looking at obesity genes and we start looking at things that become quite reductionist, but we don't understand that people's physiology, which is usually parental, we have an acquired inheritance or some kind of Lamarckian inheritance, and also that when we get the doctor saying that there's a certain gene that's driving this, but epigenetically, environmental stimulus is causing people to have dysregulated blood sugar values, aerobic physiology, mood, and self-worth issues. It's a multifactorial issue when people start to overeat. And I'm just talking about obesity. I'm talking about things that lead to obesity. And a lot of people, I think, to the uneducated person, they always see someone big walk down the street and they assume they just overeat all the time. But there can be quite a few generational interferences, whether it's especially over the last century or 2 centuries, where industrial revolution, and what we're seeing now as well is that growth is usually about bringing stuff into the marketplace as quickly as possible without rigorous testing. So if we take, like, let's say one of my favorite subjects at the moment is airborne pollutants like the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which have a specific disruptive effect to physiology. So if you've been living in a city for a long period of time, your thyroid physiology is usually disrupted, and so are many other aspects of physiology. So a lot of people will often start to overeat as a mechanism of maintaining physiology. It's a bit like when people say, oh, when you eat, you're craving sugar because you're addicted to sugar. Well, actually dial it back a notch and say your body's asking for sugar because it can't regulate it properly. So you need to look at the mechanism of why it's not being regulated properly, instead of saying, oh, you're addicted to sugar, sugar's addictive and you need to stop it out. It's the same reason when you crave salt, you're producing a lot of adrenaline, and salt can help to lower that effect or decrease the amount of adrenaline, as sugar can. So we get caught into a bit of a cycle where people's physiology is disrupted. They have a number of traits that are inherited from parents. We have an ever increasing stressful world with social media of, how kids should look, how people should look, what they should be dressing like. I've experienced it with my eldest daughter, who's 17. We have all these kind of stresses that are built on, and we've got modern technology that's adding on to those stresses as well. And the information is out there, and it's often unrestricted and unregulated. So to say that someone is overeating because they're overeating just because that's a choice is often, it's not. And there are various psychological mechanisms why people overeat as well. And I'm not going to talk about those because I'm no expert on psychological disorders by any means. But people can often start to overeat to support a failing physiology. And I think that's really important, where I'm not a big believer in fasting or the need to fast unless someone is prone to overeating. It's a strategy to stop them overeating. And I think that can be useful then. And it's like, not should you fast, is can your body even tolerate fasting? And those that are flexible might be able to tolerate this even more. But bringing it back to the overeating, there can be specific reasons why people overeat, also in the same mechanism as why people undereat. And it's just they come up with a strategy to make things either work or not work for them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does. The problem is that we usually, again, this mentality, we try to find one problem to a multifactorial problem, and we say, well, people, they must be stupid or unwillingly to change. Maybe basically it's their fault, and you want to put one direct, quick thing that maybe it's reassuring as a professional to say that it's their fault if they cannot change, and it's not hard, because it's so complex that many coaches that try to help their client lose weight, sometimes they just cannot do it, and they must think that the only thing they're doing wrong is that their client is lying, for example, or it's not possible, or they must be doing something wrong and it's not their own fault. And when you start to understand the complexity of the physiology and how the body tries all the time to regulate as the best as it can, it gets much more complicated. Maybe one thing that can talk about that can show how things work a little bit differently. For example, if you talk about cholesterol and you think you must lower cholesterol at all costs, instead of talking about, well, cholesterol can be amazing if it goes to the downstream hormones, and but what do you need for this? For example, to go into pregnenolone and all the other stages, you need enough energy because if my memory is good, the side cleavage enzyme is ATP dependent, which means that it's really hard for the body to go through the next steps for the normal physiological responses for the hormones if you are not eating enough. And so telling people under eating is the solution goes against, for example, the possibility to regulate cholesterol easily, because there's one main thing that cannot be dissociated from the rest, is how your body gets metabolically in a state where it can be regulated correctly, the best it can. So there's this nuance between this is the cause, this is the problem, this is the solution, and the body does the best it can basically with what it has, and at every single point there can be a problem, and you can try to feel what it's almost like an art. It's not a rigid science, and you tell people, well, get this blood test, you're out of this range, this is the supplement or the medication you need to get. And I'm not giving medical advice here, it's just the idea that you are basically doing the best you can, and you need to support your body and not go completely against it and try to solve the problem by punishing your body by eating less or exercising more or things like this, and try to find a certain balance. Maybe this is maybe just also a philosophical way to see how to solve problem.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, and I think Ray's talked about this, about becoming more within your environment or becoming less. And I think you're able to have better conversations with your environment. You're able to be more explorative and not closed off and not myopic to new things when you have enough energy available. If you don't have that energy physiologically and cognitively, you just don't function as well as you could do, staying in a starvation stress state. So sometimes it is about, sorry, a mosquito here, got it. They're carb loaded. I think it's about understanding that physiology functions better when it has a regular source of energy. Now, the argument is about getting that just right, for example. And for some, when you start to see aspects of physiology decrease, you'll see sleep disrupted, energy disrupted, digestion, reactions to certain situations, and how your mood is kind of as part of that. Perhaps pain. You might see cholesterol levels going up or going down, and cholesterol is just one of those markers that has context for so many people. You just can't interpret it from just that narrow physiological range that's been dictated by pharmaceutical companies to sell or statin regulation medication, because we know that cholesterol is a great antioxidant. And I think there's some studies that's come out that show that actually people with low cholesterol levels are going to die much sooner than those who aren't, when you're talking about viral infections. And that's also seems to be coming out from all the studies I've looked at in Parkinson's disease, as those with high cholesterol levels generally live longer. But that's me digressing slightly. But we talk about energy, and if you look at the studies that have looked at, there's a really big thing at the moment on calorie restriction and fasting, because it slows metabolism. Ergo, you must live longer when you slow metabolism, based upon the rate of living theory that suggests that when you cut back on everything and keep it plodding along, it must go for longer. But yet there are many studies, albeit in rodents so far, that when you give them adequate amounts of energy, they will actually live longer than the calorie restricted rodents. And there aren't many studies there aren't any studies in humans that, because obviously the long-term data doesn't exist. But if you think about it from a metabolic standpoint, aging is about physiology failing. Now, if you keep your physiology maintained by having adequate energy intake, you can keep optimal thyroid physiology, optimal liver function, optimal production of the cholesterol, steroidal, and other hormones like pregnenolone to function at their best, so that living tends to be living kind of promotes living, as it were. The better that you live in a better physiology, the more likely you are to experience life and to kind of generally go out and do more things and perhaps be more motivated to stay alive. You know, you start learning new things. People who tend to have closed off physiology are in a state of decline, whether that's the way they regulate energy from carbohydrate use, or, you know, the restrictions usually seem to be analogous to restrictions of what you're capable of doing within your mind as well, and exploring stuff. That's why older people tend to become grumpier, less open to new ideas. And I think if we look at it, comparing the rate of living theory to perhaps an optimal metabolic theory, if we can keep biology functioning at its best, it's less likely to be exposed to the nuances of diseases like cancer and heart disease, because we can keep physiology maintained to where it should be. And bearing in mind that a lot of diseases, particularly diseases associated with cancer, are because the aerobic system, the most efficient energy producing system that we have, becomes problematic, and therefore cells become problematic. So does it make sense to restrict that, or does it make sense to kind of keep them as wide and open and functioning as best as they can? And that means having adequate energy intake. And if you don't get that, I don't see how calorific restriction is going to give us these extensions to lifespan that everyone's talking about. And all of the things that are associated with optimal biological function, like mitochondrial fission and fusion, they're energy dependent. Autophagy is energy dependent. Thyroid metabolism, liver function is energy dependent. So keep giving the body regular energy without overeating, without undereating, trying to find that sweet spot. And I think the sweet spot is there when you sleep, want to have sex, digest your food well, good energy, good interaction, willing to learn new things. Your physiology is expressed when you get that adequate energy intake and the organizational hormones are there.
Yeah, I think one of the points you mentioned is sometimes a little bit difficult to talk about, because when you talk about sex, people are like, oh, I don't want to talk about my life and all of these things. But it seems so simple that if you are healthy and you are attracted by someone and you cannot even have sex with your own partner anymore, there must be something wrong. It's not just well, take a blue pill and the problem is solved, and it's eventually going to give you more problem than anything else anyway. But what I mean is that we have simple tools that we've also maybe been told that are not so relevant, but they are so relevant because it's like how can I say that? You don't want to talk about your health because you're not qualified to. It's like you cannot listen to your body because you're not qualified to. It's like you rely on someone else to tell you you're healthy or you're not, depending on this test and this or other maybe way of seeing life. But if, just like you said, something so simple like I can sleep well, I feel recovered when I wake up, I have energy throughout the whole day, I can digest pretty well what I'm eating, I want to have sex with my partner, things simple like that. My hairs are not falling. I have an interesting conversation with people around me, and I tend to move when I want to. I'm curious. I want to experience more things. All of these things I don't think cannot be completely dissociated with physiologically the way you are, and well, this is I wanted to say the funny thing, but it's not so funny. When you see people talking about low carb diets and fasting being the amazing thing, and you also try to see how they interact with people, and suddenly you see this like surge of anger or aggressive response and things like this. You think maybe there's something also. The energy available is also maybe a cognitive resource that is also linked with, I don't know, glycogen, with the astrocytes or other things, and the energy available as maybe even a broader perspective. Can you maybe comment a little bit on this, and maybe the attitude of people that tend to think that restrict yourself would it be like it could be by exercising more, or eating less, or fasting, or a few days, or a few hours, or maybe what are the premises, and maybe how you can see that you may not be as curious and eager to live a different life with new things, new perspective, conflicting ideas, and all of this, because energy is important, like in a broader sense.
Well, you kind of talked about sex, and I think libido and fertility are kind of wrapped up in that, of course. And it's like, well, I work with a lot of clients who have had trouble trying to get pregnant, and it's like, again, it comes back to energy. But you know, you talk about the reactions of someone, and it's like, the more suppressed someone's physiology it is, instead of being able to embrace somebody else's point of view, it's defensive, and it's like, no, that's wrong, or this is wrong. And it's like, you know, I've been there before. I mean, 10 years ago, 12, 13 years ago, I was still giving my clients low carb diets, no sugar, no dairy, no grains. And I thought I was doing the right thing, and I can make people quite slim because obviously you're calorie restricting a lot of foods there. When I was doing that, I was the thinnest I've ever been, which was about 10 kilos lighter than I am now. But I was the most anxious. I was the most worried. I was the most constipated. My sleep was terrible. And these are good physiological markers about whether something's working or not for you. And I think it's like, if you can have a different point of view to someone, but I think it shows good physiology to be able to interact with someone and say, look, I don't agree with you, but okay, I can understand that it's a different point of view. And if you kind of dial that back to kind of sex and libido, it's like, often when you're in a stress state of physiology, the last thing you want to do is to kind of procreate and go and spread your seed. And it's quite a common thing when people are stressed. Does it make more sense to kind of want to be slightly withdrawn and not be kind of expressing sexuality? Because that's what physiology is about. It's like, one of the first things that tends to go is the desire for sex, and also the desire to multiply. And that's it makes sense as it's like a conservative evolutionary aspect that we have. It's kind of tied up, if you want, for a better phrase, that fight or flight mechanism. It's like, if you're in that kind of if you're in that stress state, you're ready to react to a stressor, rather than to be able to react to the more positive things that are around you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. Cool. I don't know why I had this. Oh yeah, because you mentioned how libido was basically part of the basic measurement that we should keep about our physiology, and that totally makes sense. So a little bit earlier we were talking about triathletes, long distance runners, and things like this, and people like this, and we have quite a lot of data showing like a huge decrease in libido in these athletes, and at least a few of these athletes, but I think most of the time it goes above 50% of the athletes that are high level athletes. So there's something that's not just an isolated case of one guy that was especially good, and this guy had no libido. It's something that's a major part of the physiology of people that are doing, I may say, excessive, for the health perspective, not the performance perspective, too much exercise. So it can be a problem as well. That's something we tend to forget as, I may say, exercise physiologists, and we think it's the only way to go. Well, there's something wrong, just go have a run and run more if there's a problem. And yeah, that's not the way to go.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, excellent.
I didn't have anything, you said it all. I don't have anything to add.
Okay, cool. Yeah, maybe one more thing I have in mind, that do you have a few more minutes, or okay? I wanted to talk a little bit about basically. It can be a huge topic, but I don't know how you can condense it. But progesterone and estrogen, and basically also the different pollutants, and trying to bring a perspective that can help us understand why maybe estrogen can be a problem in excess. What's the difference between estrogen and the pill? What's the difference between do you say bioidentical progesterone and progesterone? Oh, yeah. Well, maybe if you can bring your perspective as someone who has a master degree in endocrinology, who can help us understand what are the big problems we tend to have with short explanations like estrogen are the positive hormone because it helps women have more repetitions when they are working out or things like this, and progesterone is actually the bad hormone, like we can hear a few people talk about, and because in the cycle at this moment, some women tend to experience bad things in general. Can you maybe, I know it's a really broad subject, but an idea about why it's so confusing when we talk about progesterone, estrogen, and in general the pollutants and estrogen, maybe also in the water, things like this, why we get so lost?
I think that the first thing is that estrogen isn't bad. You know, estrogen is an essential part of physiology. There needs to be a certain amount. The problem with estrogen is that it's a proliferative hormone. That means it creates growth, it creates more tissue. Now, it's easy to hijack that growth response because sometimes there are many mechanisms that encourage that. Now, estrogen isn't essentially a female hormone because males have it to a degree. But the problem is that despite the normal internal circulating levels or the endogenous levels, the external sources of estrogen are ubiquitous. Pollutants are stimulating the estrogen. Some call it the estrogen receptor. They have an estrogen stimulating growth effect, which means unrestrained growth or proliferation. This can be seen typically in the female because during the follicular phase, we get this surge of estrogens. Now, progesterone should be there all the time, just bubbling under the surface, still being produced. A lot of people think that it's just the estrogen, but unfortunately, estrogen tends to run amok. Now, if you're a female, for example, and premenstrual syndrome is really a product of your blood sugar being dysregulated, being irritable, no different to a guy missing a meal and being hangry. It tends to push you in these in and out of phases. Now, progesterone does tend to have this tranquilizing effect, whereas estrogen, because it synergizes with so many other stress responses like upregulation of the serotonin response, increases in cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline when their blood sugar levels low, increases in histamine responses. These can be why estrogen, not on its own, but combined with other things, can be particularly problematic. Now, during the second, or when ovulation occurs and during the luteal phase, you should be producing a bit more, females should be producing a lot more progesterone, which arrests the excessive growth that you tend to see from estrogen. And that's why a lot of females tend to suffer from endometriosis, uterine fibroids, polycystic ovaries. They're all expressions of excess estrogens. Now, unfortunately, females compared to men are 10 times more likely to suffer hypothyroidism and 9 to 10 times more likely to suffer from autoimmune diseases. Why? Because their estrogen levels are naturally higher anyway. Now, when you throw into the mix the oral contraceptive pill, polluted air, polluted water, cleaning products, even makeups can tend to have this cumulative load that can be extremely problematic. It's important to, the most problematic estrogen, we have generally three estrogens, estrone, estradiol, and estriol. Estradiol tends to, or E2 tends to be the most problematic estrogen. You tend to see in medicine, they'll often talk about estrogen hormone receptor positives or negatives. I think this is extremely problematic and reductionist to look at this way, because it doesn't, to say something that's estrogen receptor negative is perhaps suggesting that estrogen isn't the key driver, but we know that excess estrogen can have many different effects beyond the receptor. The receptor is just one way of looking at physiology in a lock and key format that says, yeah, that must work like that in a very binary fashion. But unfortunately, physiology doesn't really respond like that. But another factor is that the airborne estrogens, like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, tend to have an estrogen-like effect because they disrupt the mitochondria. So there's these constant sources that you're being bombarded from all the time. Now, if estrogen becomes excessive, it can suppress progesterone. But another way that it works, because estrogen suppresses the ability to carry and produce thyroid hormones. double whammy effect of that is that there are many environmental pollutants. The polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are just one of them that could displace, and also plastics, dioxins, phthalates. They can displace T4 from a thyroid carrier protein called transthyretin. And also another double whammy effect is the unsaturated fats can all displace T4 from this thyroid carrier. So in a relative state of estrogen excess, you'll see not just the estrogen having effects, but the pollutants will have an effect on the ability to regulate thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone can take a dive, generally when you're exposed to a polluted area, stressed area, but equally as bad for the female, going through the premenstrual phase can compound this issue much further. And this is where you'll start to see a lot of issues that are created around estrogen excess. Now, I was reading, again, another Ray Peat thing recently, and he was talking about how, because we know what's going on within soot and what's in the air, these things generally haven't been pushed as much. Because if you think about it, in theory, many people that get cancer and heart disease are a product of polluted environments. But the authorities tend to put this message out that cancer is a product of, hey, it's the genes. Hey, it's something that you're doing. You're eating the wrong type of foods. You've got to do this to try and take care of yourself. But nobody ever says, well, actually, we know that living close to a motorway is going to cause particularly disruptive effects to physiology. We know that when you're exposed to certain cleaning products, that's going to have specific effects to someone's physiology. But you've got all these inputs from industry and people that are more interested in economic growth, that put all these things out without being tested. And somebody gets cancer and they say, oh, well, it's in the genes, or it's thyroid, it's an estrogen receptor issue. It's nothing to do with the environment. And this is where this disconnect is about environmental pollutants and ecology and the effect it has. But it's really difficult to hold people accountable for this. So I know I'm going off slightly on this, but I think because there's so much emphasis on it's what somebody's doing that it's their fault and they need to change to create the change, that can be a very small component of it when the environment around them is causing all of the aspects of biology to degrade.
Well, okay. Well, that's exactly what I wanted you to develop. It's amazing. I also have one thing in mind, because you talked about the problem of people being accountable for the problem they may be putting in directly. For example, I have the article of maybe you read this one, Carla Rothenberg. From Harvard, who did an article on the estrogen industry. That's really interesting. I will stop there to avoid problems, but basically there are things you can read about this that can be surprising, and also you can find in the different types of risks you can have for cancer. For example, I don't remember the type, the number of the letter, but estrogen are in the list and one of the top contributors. So it's surprising to hear so easily people talk about estrogen as being just one more thing you can take maybe before, if you have a problem with your cycle. If you don't have your cycle anymore, you can still take the pill, and later during your life, if you have problems, you can also take more estrogen through hormone replacement therapy. So it's confusing.
It is completely crazy. And I still don't understand how a lot of clever people can go through years and years of medical education and not understand some very, very basic aspects of physiology. And like I said, it depends to who you talk to. But progesterone seems to, if you didn't know any better, and I think I mentioned this to Vasilis, it's like a lot of women are told that it's progesterone production in the luteal phase of the cycle that causes the issues. If you're estrogen dominant, your ability to suppress progesterone during that phase is very easy to do. So you're just having this kind of binary blame on, you're in that phase, so it must be progesterone that's doing that. And it's pretty crazy. We know that progesterone does many, many good things. And that's why you'll see studies within traumatic brain injury, I've seen it in Parkinson's. I've seen Parkinson's clients respond really, really well to progesterone. But the estrogen, because it has this effect that tends to cause many things like accumulation of water, swelling, estrogen promotes glycolysis. Now, we know that glycolysis, if that's unrestrained and perpetuated, you have a lot of problems when you have a lot of glycolysis occurring, because it promotes the formation of lactate. Formation of lactate is very, very hard to keep up with. And that's where we tend to start to see disruptions to optimal aerobic physiology. There's nothing wrong with being able to go from, optimal aerobic metabolism to fall back on glycolysis. But if it's being unrestrained, estrogen is causing excess glycolysis, formation of lactate. We start to see issues related to aerobic metabolism disruption, particularly at the electron transport chain, and that area of aerobic metabolism being very, very compromised. And estrogen does that in every single aspect of the electron transport chain.
Oh, okay.
So we know that there are problems with this. Unfortunately, there are large bodies of people that have an invested interest in money, and you can sound like a conspiracy theorist, and I often do, but when you look at the data and the reasons behind it, the amount of money invested in certain interventions, you can understand why this does tend to occur.
Yeah, I think that's always one path you can decide to follow, the famous follow the money. It's not necessarily it's only about money, but it can always help you to have one complementary perspective, at least. So we can put it this way to make sure that we don't think, well, even as scientists, we don't live in a world devoid of money. So we need to consider it anyway, even if it's difficult, and even if we are not used to talk about money, just like people who did commercial studies, but still, it's always a point you need to consider. Yeah, I think we can put it this way. So people are not going to say we are only thinking it's only a question of money, but you just need to take at least into account this factor. But yeah,
for sure.
Amazing. I think for a first informal chat, it's amazing. If it's good for you, I think we can stop there. Maybe you can just tell us where we can find more of your work if we'd like to know more what you are doing. For example, on social media, I'll put this anyway in the description, and what you do as well, maybe for a living, or put it as you want.
I mean, I offer coaching programs for people with energy, digestion, fatigue, mood, fertility related stuff. And there are coaching programs available on the site. I have put together a functional endocrinology and nutrition program for people who want more in-depth knowledge on that. And it's encompassing a lot of things we talked about. At the moment, there's about 15 seminars on there. I aim to add one every month or two. So there's that for practitioners. And you can find me on Instagram, Tommo Littlewood. And Balanced Body Mind is the website that I have online.
Excellent. Well, it's going to be really easy to read in the description, so people can follow your work and the rest you are doing. It's amazing. So, well, a big thank you. I really enjoyed this one. And if you have comments or questions, I'll try to transfer them to him. But he's really busy, so you can find him directly on the website we are going to put in the description. Thank you so much for your time, and maybe see you later if you want. See you soon.
C'est parfait. Bonsoir, mon ami.
Oh, that was excellent. How many times did you practice this one?
No, that's my schoolboy stuff. That's all I know.
Nice. We'll end on this one. Excellent. Cool. Thank you. Bye-bye.